So welcome everyone. I am Frank Vagnone, President and CEO of Old Salem Museums and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. One thing that I'm not so sure that people viewing tonight understand is that we have really three collections and groups of artifacts. The first is the Old Salem collection, and those are artifacts that the organization owns itself and has a bit wider audience than the second collection, which is the Wachovia Historical Society. And that collection is very focused on the Moravians of Salem. We take care of that collection and oversee its stewardship. The third collection is the MESDA collection, and it's really considered one of the most important collections of Southern artifacts and material culture, ranging from actual architectural features to pottery and furniture pieces. Tonight, we have the really wonderful moment to look at one of these artifacts and start to relate it to issues of memory. One of the things that has happened in COVID is instead of really retreating into being much more quiet about our mission, we did the exact opposite. And we determined that we would move in directions that we had not actually moved and that we would expand our audience and expand our narratives. And tonight's discussion is exactly one of those. The Things series was about pulling National Museum colleagues and their favorite objects in a relationship with one of our objects and talking about a theme that connected these things through time and space. So with that, I'm very happy to welcome our distinguished group of people who will be talking about this particular artifact. And so welcome again. I'm very happy that you're here.
Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you for welcoming everybody tonight from the Fourth House. I'm Daniel Ackermann. I am the Chief Curator at Old Salem Museums and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And it is my privilege to be with you tonight live from the William C. and Susan S. Mariner Southern Ceramics Gallery. So welcome to Things. In each episode of this, we aim to use objects to draw out larger connections and contexts between objects and between people across historical, geographic, social, and political lines. And tonight, we'll be talking about one of the great universals, food, and two objects in particular, a chicken brick and a childhood cookie jar that connect us to place, to taste, and probably most importantly, to memory. And joining us tonight are visiting guest curator Samaya Garrison and culinary historian Dr. Jessica B. Harris. And moderating our conversation tonight is Dr. Marcy Cohen-Ferris. At the end of our conversation, we'll have a chance to pose some of your questions to our guests. Just use the Q&A button in your Zoom window. Our moderator for tonight's conversation is American Studies scholar Dr. Marcy Cohen-Ferris. Dr. Ferris is Professor Emeritus in the Department of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also a distinguished scholar and author on a wide range of subjects, and two of her books that are my personal favorites are The Edible South, The Power of Food in the Making of an American Region, and my personal favorite, Matzo Ball Gumbo, a culinary tales of the Jewish South. And Marcy, thank you so much for joining us tonight from Chapel Hill as moderator for this episode.
Well, absolutely. I'm so delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. I want to thank you, Daniel and Frank and MESDA for the invitation to moderate this conversation tonight with Professor Jessica Harris and MESDA's visiting guest curator, Samaya Garrison. So I was trying to figure, I've been working with MESDA for close to 40 years. That is so frightening. You know, when I tried to figure this out, beginning, I guess, with my first visit as like a young history graduate student or even undergrad way back. But I did my graduate work at the College of William and Mary in the 1980s. And then once I was at Chapel Hill for many years, Daniel hosted exciting MESDA field trips for me and my students as we explored its collections and spaces. And I just always thought that MESDA was just all food objects, really, because as you walk through the museum, you know, you see carved tea tables and dining tables and sideboards and chairs and pottery storage jars and jugs from the Carolinas and Moravian style serving plates made and other objects made in Salem and low country sweet grass baskets for winnowing rice and large silver spoons for serving Carolina gold rice and imported china and dishware. It's all evidence of the complex systems of Southern foodways. And these objects of Southern foodways, like really the food itself, are filled with meaning. What literary scholar Richard Gray describes as the undertow, that undertow of memory. I love that. I love that phrase. But, you know, the question is like, how do you read these objects? And, you know, the objects at MESDA, but also what we can think of so many other Southern food objects that we have and that are probably in the collection at MESDA too. An iron pot, a rolling pin. Here I have my Russian grandmother's rolling pin, Luba Cohen. I don't know if she brought it. I probably didn't bring it from Russia. She probably bought it on the Lower East Side, but it's of New York, but it's very important to me. You know, an apron, a cookie jar, a pottery chicken roaster or chicken brick. And why do these objects matter? You know, we know that objects reveal and artifacts reveal cultural perspectives and human interaction from other times, the life experience and mentality of people different from our own, from us, but deeply connected by place and memory and history. And my colleague at Carolina, Bernie Herman, who many of y'all know, Bernie says there are no innocent objects, no innocent objects. Every artifact has a history that lies just beneath its surface. So the two objects that Professor Harris and Miss Garrison have brought to our conversation tonight have a lot to say. So both are containers, a 19th century chicken roaster and a 20th century cookie jar. So these are three-dimensional containers used in food preparation and food storage. You know, it seems pretty simple on the surface. They hold a record of a specific culinary grammar or purpose of particular dishes or of sweet treats, recipes, but they also contain other sorts of knowledge that we'll talk about tonight, like memory, smell, labor, pain, joy, domestic rhythms and rituals. There's a lot of voices of women in these objects, mothers and daughters and grandmothers and aunties, of makers and workers, of enslaved and free people, of children and elders, of advertisements and jingles, of race and class and gender and place. So let's get this conversation started, and we're going to start with Samaya. So I want to introduce Samaya Garrison. Hi, Samaya.
Hi.
She is the visiting guest curator for MESDA. She's a North Carolina native. She graduated from Winston-Salem State University. She holds a master's degree in heritage studies and public history from the University of Minnesota, where she was also a Mellon Fellow in 2019. Her research explores and documents the intersection of women and African culture and history and social movements. And while she was in Minnesota, she worked on many exhibits, on curriculum design, on collection management, but she's largely focused on African-American materials at the distinguished Minnesota Historical Society and at the Minnesota African-American Heritage Museum and Gallery. Her scholarship took her to Kenya for a cultural immersion study program in 2018. And at MESDA, just one of the many things that she's been doing is to develop a special Southern Pathways self-guided tour that's focused on the intersection between Old Salem's collection and historic foodways. And as like I would argue, there's nothing else at MESDA. It's all foodways. So Samaya, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So let's talk about the chicken roaster.
Yes, let's talk about this chicken roaster.
There it is. This is an amazing thing. This is an amazing thing. So I love that you picked this object. So my first thing I got to ask you is, can you introduce us to your object that you brought to this conversation, and tell us how and where you met, and just a little bit about it, like its age, its material, even though we've got a little bit of some of description there. I just love to hear from you.
Yeah, so the chicken roaster, I knew I wanted to do a pathway on food, and I had found some other items to focus on: a breakfast table, some face vessels, and other various items in my exhibit. However, the chicken roaster, Daniel, chief curator at MESDA, introduced me. I like to call him a him. He's a him to me, and he's about 100 to 160 to 190 years old. It was created between 1830 and 1860 in Piedmont, North Carolina, by John Highland or Heinz Schaffner. Is unglazed earthenware. On one side is domed, while the other side is flattened. Two of the two pieces that come together, and you can see they make a perfect bulb shape. On the other side of the roaster, not that flat piece, but there's like a small hole that lets out the steam, where the two pieces connect that. The roaster still smells of grease. You can kind of smell it. It reminds you of your grandma's old cast iron skillet, and the way it still kind of smells like whatever food you cooked in it. As we know, you can't scrub a cast iron skillet down. So that's the same way you would do a chicken roaster or a chicken brick, which they're called now chicken bricks. But you would just clean them with a brush and some hot water and a little bit of soap. But yeah, so that's how we met, through Daniel. And once he introduced me to this item, because the pictures hadn't been uploaded to the website, it was just a description. And once I saw it, I was just immediately intrigued about it and wanted to just learn a little bit more. So yeah, that's
Had
a
you
little.
ever seen one before?
Not before this, not before this project, no.
Yeah. And so just tell everybody, how does it work? Like, what do you do with it
So
physically?
you take it apart. It's two pieces,
Okay.
and you don't need to add any juices to it. It's gonna create its own juices from the steam once that other piece goes on top. So it opens up into two pieces. It's not that big. You can hold it in your hand. This is a smaller one. The Western Mill Pottery Company, they make them today, and they're really large. And
In,
still
in
same
England, right?
in England, and they're only for like about $45. I was tempted to order one, but you can cook inside of it. You can roast vegetables. The steam makes its own juices. You don't need anything more than some olive oil, if that. So it just reminds you of a modern day cast iron skillet with a top, or maybe like some type of pot that can go in the oven, but it's really small. This one is like really small.
And did you have to soak it in water first to allow, did you take the piece and put it in water first, or, who would ever have used it?
So yeah, so they tell you that you should rinse it in cold water before you use it, um, to make sure none of the clay residue is, still on there or anything like that. And then when you're done with it, just to rinse it in hot water and a little bit of soap, after you use it. And then make sure it's dry completely before you store it. Because this particular roaster isn't glazed, and that was probably due to John Holland not being a really good glazer in his time. He had some economic troubles with keeping up the pottery house, and it was reported that he didn't glaze many of his items. So this is unglazed, unlike a lot of the other materials. And earthenware is pretty different than stoneware, which most people are used to. But we can get into that if you want to.
Amazing. So that potter, Samaya, what do you know what country of origin that potter was? Do we think it was German or sounds like it?
Was German, him or Heinz Schaffner? I know he came a little bit later. I do know that his father had allowed him to be an apprentice in a pottery shop in Salem, and that he didn't do very well. He was hardworking, but he was chastised mostly for being lazy, which is why it's not glazed. But and then they reported that he burnt a lot of his items in the stove, and
Wow.
then kind of like talked his way out of his contract and started selling all the earthenware once he took ownership of the shop. And then Heinz Schnaffner, who came a little bit later, reported that he didn't really like working with him, but he worked there for a while until he went into his own practice.
And so this piece, it's just a really important piece. I think I'm going to just gather from what you're saying within MESDA's history, because it really speaks to that strong tradition within North Carolina production pottery in the 19th century
Yeah.
that was happening in Salem itself with Moravian pottery and earthenware wares. But then elsewhere in the state, right, we have like what, 2 other major pottery centers in the state.
Yes.
And it was worked just like similar to this, utilitarian pieces that, again, it's all about foodways, right? Those
Yeah.
kind of forms.
Yes, all about foodways, and it kind of merged with the party that was already going that was already occurring here with Native Americans. So once colonization occurred, it kind of just expanded, and earthenware was like really popular between like the 1750s and the 1840s. But most of those pieces that still preserved today were glazed.
Right. So yeah, North Carolina is really known for that lead glazed earthenware,
Yes.
salt glazed stoneware, and then the alkaline glazed stoneware. And the combination of those 3 major types of traditional pottery make it so distinctive. And I guess it's because it's a border state kind of between the north and the south, but it's amazing heritage. So who do you think, if we kind of think about what kind of family would have owned this and who would have used it? If you imagine those worlds of once it left the potter's, studio or shop, who did it go to?
I'm gonna assume it was probably purchased by a white family, and it could very well have been mostly used by an enslaved woman that worked in the kitchen and that did most of the cooking and most of the kitchen work for that family. So it was probably owned by a white family, but an enslaved woman probably used it most likely, for sure.
Right, right. So that's a powerful piece of the object's memory
Mhm.
as an object of labor.
Yes.
It's really a powerful object of labor. And when I was reading the description, I think that y'all shared with me that the piece has been in continuous use as a chicken roaster from the time it was originally made until it was acquired by the seller. And at the time that it was acquired by Old Salem, like you said, it still smelled faintly of grease, chicken grease, right? We think. And that is so powerful to me. The fact that it still has this odor, that it's soaked into the porous clay, it kind of gives it even a more of a sense of life and animation. Could you smell anything?
I did not get to touch the brick, of course, in person because of COVID.
Because of COVID.
Yes, but Joanna did do a walkthrough for me, and she said it still does smell. You can have a faint scent of the smell from it, and it's just like a living, breathing object. It's like it's still alive. It's still holding those memories. There's probably plenty of communal meals that was produced from this chicken roaster, and just a lot of conversation starters just starting at this one little pot.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk to Jessica more about kind of the history of the guinea hen, of poultry, and why that is such an important small livestock animal, and the connection it has to Africa too, as well. I wanted to mention and just bring up and kind of honor her work in this conversation when we're talking about chicken and the tradition of kind of African American labor. the work of Psyche Williams-Forson, and y'all probably know her work, published by UNC Press many years ago, not many years ago, but a few years ago, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power. And that chicken brick needs to be in here. That needs to, it is a really an important part of the kind of issues that Psyche Williams-Forson talks about. She's chair of American Studies in Maryland, at University of Maryland. And that book looked at the complexity of Black women's legacy using food as a form of cultural work. And she looks at negative interpretations of Black culture that are associated with chickens and chicken imagery. But she also looks at how African-American women, Black women, forge their own self-definitions and relationships to what she calls the gospel bird. And she argues that practices of feminism are inherent in the foods that women prepare and serve. And certainly, I think there's a lot of that power in an object like that. Would you agree with that, Samaya?
Yes, I do agree. And I feel as though that she would probably start examining this object starting back with like African women, and then Native women and their practices in roasting and farming, and then as a Black woman, then as a Black chef, like how much wealth was acquired from this roaster, what type of soul food was created with this roaster, what does soul food do for the Black soul, or just different conversation starters, even referencing Verda Mae Smart Grosvenor and her vibration cooking, and on the way she explores the kitchen, and or even just to go to like what defines a kitchen, or where does the notion of soul food even come from, or how does gardening show up today in Black communities? Is there room for gardening in public school systems, where these marginalized communities usually attend to, or in prisons or nursing homes? So I think it would be like a really interesting conversation to have with her about this subject.
That's really powerful to me, the way that you help us understand how you make sense of and critique kind of the deep meaning of this kind of object. And it was really an everyday object, right? It was a pretty utilitarian object.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, extremely functional, probably used on a day-to-day basis. Like you said, living and breathing. It survived probably through memories. Bring out the chicken roaster, like the way you bring out the grill, like let's light up the grill, let's light up the chicken roaster. But I'm sure it held some like really good meanings and feelings. And I just think about, I cooked a Cornish hen the other day. I cooked 2 for my family. And then I was just sitting there thinking about the process to go through while preparing the chicken for the roasters and what I do now. So, you rub down the chicken like you would like a baby with baby oil. But for me, I put a little bit of chicken broth at the bottom of the pan and cover it with foil to imitate that steamed roast aesthetic, the way you would get a roasted chicken from Walmart, or for our Southeastern viewers, Food Line. So yeah, I just use chicken broth or with aluminum foil and try to imitate that same taste or feeling. But if I had my hands on one of these, it'd be a little bit easier.
I know it sounds like you have as much skill as in the museum as you do also within your own family kind of worlds and culinary worlds too. And I can't believe that like during COVID, chicken bricks just didn't like go wild like sourdough bread or something, because it seems like such a contemporary kind of object right now, an artifact like that you would see, since people have turned so much to home cooking and handmade, and kind of turning to caring for their families with the meals they prepare. And this feels really contemporary in that it is a very natural way
Mhm.
to prepare chicken, and it's healthy. It's healthy.
Yes, and it's healthy. Like you can roast vegetables inside
Yeah,
of it. You
cool.
don't add too much oil to it. It's
Okay.
just-
Well, I think we'll move on to Jessica, but I do think that Mesda's going to have to sell a chicken brick pretty soon
I would agree.
because we all need these. Thank you, Samaya. We'll come back. We'll talk more. Hey, Miss Jessica,
Hey, Miss Marcy. How
how
are you?
how are you?
I'm here. I'm fine. I'm
Coming,
holding my baby.
coming to us from Brooklyn.
Yep, from the Independent People's Republic of Brooklyn.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So let me introduce Dr. Harris. There's really no greater expert on food and foodways of the African diaspora than Jessica Harris. She's a professor, a journalist, a contributing editor, a radio and television documentarian, and she is the author of 12 critically acclaimed books documenting the food and foodways of the African diaspora. I'll mention just a couple: Iron Pots and Wooden Spoons, Africa's Gifts to New World Cooking; The Welcome Table, African American Heritage Cooking; a very important text, High on the Hog, which I have right here, High on the Hog, all labeled, all stickied up. And High on the Hog, A Culinary Journey from Africa to America, which won the International Association for Culinary Professionals 2012 prize winner for culinary history. Her most recent book is My Soul Looks Back, a memoir. She's received many awards, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southern Foodways Alliance at the University of Mississippi. She was a founding member of the Southern Foodways Alliance. She was inducted into the James Beard Who's Who of Food and Beverage in the United States. Besides being a professor at Queens in New York for almost 5 decades, she was an inaugural scholar in residence in the Ray Charles Chair in African American Material Culture at Dillard University in New Orleans, where she helped establish an institute for the study of culinary cultures. Y'all have come across her work also. If you've been to the Smithsonian's relatively new National Museum of African American History, she helped to curate the dining venue, the Sweet Home Cafe, which is a very exciting and amazing part of the museum. She's also, I'll just mention this really quickly, the featured historian for a new Netflix series that's about to premiere called High on the Hog: How African American Cuisine Transformed America. And that's a 4-part Netflix docu-series that will debut on May 26th. So be looking for that. So there we go.
Goodness.
Let's talk about that guy in your lap. I wanted to see if you could please introduce us to your object and tell us how and where you met.
Well, he doesn't have a name, which I'm going to have to remedy. So I'm going to have to decide what he needs to be called. But he is my cookie jar, and he's been around for as long as I can remember, which means he's got 7 decades plus time on the top of a refrigerator in any house that I've lived in. He was in the house where I was born. He lived with my mother, and after my mother passed, he came to live with me in Brooklyn, where he resides on the top of the refrigerator. It was only when Daniel began to ask me about objects that I started to think about things, because I thought, gosh, I'm a thingy kind of person. So I live in a house full of stuff. Bernie Herman would have swivel head and go nuts in my house. It's like, well, should I use the Fanner basket from South Carolina? Should I use the apple picking thing? Shall I use, so it was about choices, and I had narrowed it down to my grandmother's cast iron skillet, and I wasn't sure. And then I looked at the top of the refrigerator, and he looked back at me and said, "Really? You're going to use something other than me? You know it's me, so use me." So that was how he got to be my object. And I think it revitalized him. He's very pleased with being here tonight. And what I didn't even realize was just holding him feels comfortable. So he feels like home. He really, all of those things that you were talking about in terms of memory and the personal mythology of food and the way that things come together in ways that you don't even expect, but that are filled with emotion, and the way that food, the classic kind of, the cliche about food is Proust's Madeleine. So when you start to think about Proust's Madeleine and how that transforms and takes you back to places, I didn't know that the cookie jar would do it, but he's having fun with me tonight.
Yeah, I'm sure he said to you, "What do you mean the cast iron pan? You've only known him for 40 years."
Right. Well, the cast iron pan was my grandmother's, so my
Okay.
grandmother gave it to my mother as a wedding present because it was all she had to give her.
Oh.
But that was, so, but he said, nah, you need something
Right.
sweet. You need something sweet. Enough with this frying stuff.
And look at me, I've been sitting on top of the refrigerator with my bow tie on for years.
He said, I'm a handsome devil and I need my moment in the sun.
So can you tell us a little bit about the makers? Because I know everyone have heard of McCoy Pottery in Zanesville, Ohio. They were one of the most important early 20th century commercial. It's interesting to think about the pottery production in North Carolina is that so much earlier. And this kind of production pottery that we see in McCoy is a whole nother world.
Right. Well, he is, I didn't know this until, it sort of was indecorous of me to turn him over and look at his bottom, but his bottom says McCoy. I'm sure you can't see it, but if you look, he says McCoy.
Yeah, we can see it.
It was McCoy Pottery. And I had to go, online and look him up. And McCoy they were established about 1910. And they were originally in Roseville, Ohio, I think. And he apparently became one of their objects around 1947. And now that's kind of interesting because that was the year before I was born. So I am assuming that my parents moved into a new house right around then. And in the furnishing of their house, then bought a cookie jar because it would have added a nice homey touch. And that's how he kind of came along. But he is McCoy. He apparently came into their production line in 1947 and has lived with us since certainly 1948, and who knows beyond that. Now, the interesting thing is that McCoy was also known for their Mammy cookie jars. And in my childhood, my mother's younger sister had one of those. And I always, it was another place and another time. And it was like, well, why did we get the bear and she gets the lady, So there was a whole nother sense of it. And, but everybody in the family somehow or other had a cookie jar of some sort, whether it was a plain barrel or whether it was one of the Mammy ones, or whether it was, my fine young gentleman here, that was part of their home. That was part of, I guess, the thing that talked about how there was always something sweet around, because he was always, I'm remiss. He is an empty cookie jar, but when my mom was alive and when I was a child, he always had something in his tummy. So he always had some form of cookie,
That's
in mind.
cool. I love what you said about it was one of the first artifacts or objects that your parents, after they were young marrieds and there you were born, that they bought for the kitchen because it so said we're a family, and we're this American family, of this at this point in our lives. In a cookie jar, it says it kind of performs something not only just for having cookies in the kitchen, but also that you you can normal, have that ritual of a cookie in your life and
Well,
in
it's
jar.
also the connector to the so-called American dream. I am a child of the 1950s.
Exactly.
If you begin to think about aspirational African Americans and the American dream, and I am an only child, so it was an extraordinarily nuclear family, and so it was mommy, daddy, baby, a cookie jar, all of those things together that read certainly to my aspirational African American family as American, as what that meant. And so I'm sure that that was not necessarily a conscious part of it, but I suspect a subconscious part of it as well.
And in the same way that that the racist objects that the McCoy pottery and many other production potteries of the time made, that at first glance people thought, oh, innocent objects. And again, back to Bernie, there are no innocent objects. They reified racism, reinforced it in American homes across the country, and it was where it's where children learned about race and racism.
Well,
And
yes and no, because I mean, I think we've got to, I can't say tread lightly there, but I think we have to also be mindful that, as with some of the trademarks at the period, remember that what they were reflecting, however racist they may be as we look back at them, they were also reflecting a certain kind of culinary excellence.
yes,
If you had this big fat lady who was giving you cookies, they were good cookies, and you liked those cookies, and you wanted those cookies, and you wanted to get those cookies from that lady. It's just like, Aunt Jemima was on that box because she was representing something you wanted to have.
right. So it was like a seal of approval, like brand,
In a
was that
nice,
Southern brand?
way. Very backhanded, but if you look at it that way, you really do have to think of another kind of way of just another approach, which isn't to say that they weren't racist, which isn't to say that they didn't embed an awful lot of ugly, but it is also something that needs to be thought of in that sense as well, because I think that very much there was that aspect to it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And that many of those advertising companies that created those brands, those were New York advertising companies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that we're certainly not Southern,
Right.
but that wasn't to say that racism didn't exist in New York. It certainly did, and all of those ads and things promoted a certain kind of servitude and servileness that was certainly detrimental.
Can you hold it up and describe it to us? Because I don't even know if everybody can tell it's a bear.
Okay, he's a bear. He's a bear holding a cookie. Okay, so there's his cookie.
It's the paint's faded a little, right?
His paint has faded, but I don't think he was ever completely polychromed. I think he was only parts of him were painted. You can see that he's got one eye that sort of retained and one eye that didn't in his nose. And I think his mouth may have had, well, he's got a little trace of red in his mouth. There was some brown on his cookie, and it looks like it's a chocolate chip cookie because there seem to be chips or something along the side of him. And he's got a bow tie and what looks to be like a little jacket that's almost like a chef's jacket.
Yeah, and I think they
nice,
described it like, didn't he have his cookie kind of stuck in his vest?
I think maybe his cookie is stuck in his vest. I'm not even sure, but he has little toenails and they're painted, and fingernails and they're painted. He's quite a cunning little gentleman, and so he's winsome. He's something that when you go to him, you sort of smile and are pleased.
Yeah.
And I mean, horrible as it may be, you have to decapitate him to get your cookie. so that his head comes off, and then the cookie jar is the inside.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So let's bring Samaya back into our conversation here.
Well, I wanted to ask Samaya, and actually ask you as well. I in the, I guess it's the 70s or 80s, there was a whole tradition of cooking in terracotta that came back out. And I mean, I have something that looks very much like a chicken brick that's definitely not dated beyond the 70s at its oldest, but that was part of a whole culinary trend back then, which was the terracotta cooking that I think was Italian. And I think one of the things that was interesting about it, I'm going to put him down on the floor, because if I drop him and he breaks, I'll be heartbroken. But he can go down on the floor. But that I think was Italian. And I'm wondering if it was small sized, because Samaya, you say it's small sized because of the size of the chickens. You know, we are so busy eating all of these, you know, fatted chickens that we don't remember that chickens were really not that, you know, exploded size, that they were much smaller.
Pre-industrial chicken.
Yeah. Or as a friend of mine in Africa refers to all of the, well, actually in Senegal, to be specific, referred to all of the chickens that came packaged in the supermarket as morgue chickens. She liked to buy her chickens on the claw or on the hoof, as it were, you know.
Jessica, check your camera.
Stuck?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm unstuck. I'm back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you, Samaya, did you want to say something about that?
I only know a little bit about organic chickens, due to the chickens that walk around my mom's yard, and then the chickens from my great grandma's farm. But that would make sense that there's not all those preservatives and everything pumped into the chicken to make big great chickens. And then you get like the organic chicken from the grocery store, you can see the size difference.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, one looks like a baby turkey and the other one is like, oh, okay.
But you're so right. You know, like when I was saying, and Samaya and I were talking about how this does feel like a contemporary object. You're right, Jessica, because I had one of those. I forgot that I had one of those terracotta things to cook chicken in. I mean, yeah, how could I forget? I had one of those too.
We all did.
Yeah.
Was
so, Jessica, can you quickly kind of tell us maybe a little bit about the poignancy or the why, like the guinea hen comes to how it comes?
Well, I think
Black life in the South.
Before we get to the guinea hens, let's just, I mean, for people who read Roots, if you remember Roots, or who even saw Roots on television, you remember that Ben Vereen plays Chicken George. And the whole notion of chicken men and women, the whole notion of the animal husbandry. It was wonderful, Samaya, that you talk about your great-grandmother's farm. She is, if she's raising chickens, in that long tradition of African-American men and women who were known for their, not only their cooking of it, but also their raising of chickens and their animal husbandry with chickens. And while in Roots, Chicken George is involved with fighting roosters and fighting cocks, that mastery of fowl, if you will, was something that was very much attributed to African Americans throughout, male and female, so that they were noted for having a way with them and being able to breed and crossbreed and create chickens that would be good fighting cocks, but that also might also be good producers, good layers. Never forget that the good thing about a chicken is, you know, you have a hen and it lays eggs, so you're getting things that are being reproduced, and then when it gets too old, you've got coq au vin, you know, so you've got or the rooster gets too old, you've got coq au vin. When the hen gets too old, you've got chicken stew or something wonderful like that. But so you've got all of this coming out of it. Now you've referenced, Marcy, guinea hens. And guinea hens are interesting. First of all, just the name. I always love to look at the etymology of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk about eggplants as guinea squash. We talk about guinea pigs. We don't even think about the guinea in them, but in guinea hen, we talk about it. And then if you look at even the Latin name for a guinea hen, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's Numidade, referring back to Numidia.
Wow.
And what was Numidia? Numidia was a land that was in Northwest Africa that went from Libya to Morocco as it expanded. So you're even got the Latin, but name. I guess it's the species that is referencing an African genesis, or at least an African connection with these fowl. And they are certainly consumed in Southern North America. In the South, not as much, but in other parts of the American hemisphere. They are eaten in Brazil, where they're called conquén, and very much a part of not only the culinary traditions, but also the culinary religious traditions. Conquén belong to Yemanya, and they are sacrificed to her and eaten in her honor. So that we get this notion with guinea hen that is so very much a part of what's coming out of and around this mastery of fowl. And I think I've stopped again. I'm coming back.
Thanks.
But
Yeah.
there it all is.
Wow, that's fascinating. There's a lot contained
Literally in that chicken brick.
in that chicken brick. It really feels like such a loud object to me. I mean, both of these objects speak and tell really strong stories. And Samaya and I were talking a little bit about, I asked her what relationship did she see between these two objects. And Samaya, share what you said to me. I thought that was so beautiful.
We were talking, and I just immediately thought of like church gatherings, and how, like, when you go to church, you're gonna have chicken and you're gonna have a treat, and you're gonna have chicken and you're gonna have a treat, and it's just when you go to church, whether it's for a funeral or a political meeting or Wednesday Bible study, you know that that's going to be there. And then, what are they called? The tea
cakes.
The tea cakes.
Yeah.
That's sometimes served, and it just, I just immediately thought of it when I heard that there was going to be a cookie jar there, because I don't know, chicken and cake is just home to me. So,
Okay.
so
Okay.
it just made sense.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that's interesting is I hadn't even thought about it, but certainly that cake connection with church suppers. And at my church when I was growing up, we always had a Palm Sunday tea, and that was when cakes would have come from everybody. And so that whole idea. There are cake traditions and pie traditions within the African American world, but frankly, not that many cookie traditions. The cookie traditions tend to be more recent. The deeper and older traditions would be cakes and pies, and then probably older than that, gingerbreads, and not gingerbread in the sense of the cookies, but gingerbread in the sense of the breads almost. And so that there's that as well. So I guess that's something that's unusual about the cookie jars, in that it wasn't something that necessarily grew organically out of African American foodways. I remember that my mother and I used to bake once I was older for the cookie jar, and we would bake. My mother was actually a trained dietitian, and so we had her copy of Fanny Farmer. Okay. And so as she got very much older, she actually studied bookbinding briefly, and I have her rebound old copy that she bound herself of the Fanny Farmer, but there was a recipe in it for something called, I believe, Scottish Fancies, and they were oatmeal cookies.
Mm.
And they were very kind of brittle. They would, you know, drop oats everywhere, but they were delicious. And they were often in the cookie jar. It wasn't so much the chocolate chip cookies or anything like that. It was the oatmeal cookies and something. So all of
And
those things.
yeah, Samaya, I think you were going to say something.
Oh no, I was just listening to her story. Or now when you see like political rallies or meetings pre-COVID, they would have cookies at them. And you could
Mhm.
take a cookie and take a little flag or something while you go, or how like food is so interconnected within politics or campaigning or even the sit-ins. Like I know I had read that in High in the Hall, but you know, like my first interaction with food or being using food as a weapon was reading about sit-ins and
Mhm.
how extraordinary it is that you just take a seat at this lunch counter
Yeah.
and turn America upside down. And it's just
Right. And that was North Carolina too. So
North Carolina, A&T, I attended. So
Mhm.
it's just amazing like how food is so interconnected in our everyday lives and we don't even really realize it.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's so extraordinary about food and why food is such a wonderful lingua franca for people is because the human condition is such that whether or not we like it, we all need it. If we
Mhm.
don't eat, we die.
Yeah.
So we all have and have to have some kind of an opinion about it, even if you don't like food, don't want to eat. You know, there are people who obviously live to eat and eat to live and so on and so forth. But people who are absolutely neutral or even negative about it still have to consume in order to stay on the planet. So
Mhm.
that there's all of that that's inherent in the study of food as well. And it's also why food becomes so potent as, first of all, as a form of communication, but equally as an ability to, as you were saying, Samaya, to be used for politics, for political gain and aim, um, because it is something with which we identify so strongly.
Mhm.
So that's another part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful. It's so true. And that lunch counter from Greensboro, it's in the International
In the museum. Yeah.
Civil Rights Museum now in Greensboro. And what an incredibly powerful artifact. They did try to order food
Mhm.
there, you know, a piece of pie. Um, and I've been thinking, I've really been struck, and maybe y'all have too, about the power of another food setting would be Cups Food, the Cup store, you know, the food store in Minnesota, which George Floyd died in front of. That place, and the as we all witnessed those videos again and again and again, that he was engaged with buying what, you know, you know, a drink, where people came in to engage in the simplest of ordinary food interactions, food and drink. And I
Mhm.
think now when the historic marker will go up, I mean, there already are, right? The people have made that space such a historic and sacred space, but about that food setting there.
Mm.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, the way that those corner stores in New York, they're bodegas, but the
Right.
way that they become anchors of communities,
Yeah.
but also strangely and in a reverse kind of way, the way that they become so powerful because they are often in areas where they are the only place where you can get food, the
Mhm.
only place where you can get something to prepare a meal because the supermarket
Mhm.
is on the other side of town.
Right.
You know, so
That's exactly how it's set up. It occurred, the Cups food is at 38th in Chicago, and I live
Ah,
in South Minneapolis at 48th in Chicago. And when I first got up there, I had to ride the bus. I didn't have a car or whatever. And there isn't any supermarkets nearby. There's a co-op that's really expensive that had been protested against by community members because they knew how expensive that it would be to shop there. And that Cuts Food Market is the only place to really get fast access to food. Like there's no
Wow.
accessibility on food. And a colleague of mine, we did a research um, project, and then it turned into an exhibit on food access in South Minneapolis. And
Right.
we mapped how different it had changed. So at first it was like community gardens and small supermarkets, and how it changed over time to where it was just that co-op and Cups Food, and you had to ride a bus for an hour today
Wow.
to get to Walmart, or which isn't really good access, but I'm not gonna go there. But yeah, so you're exactly right. That's exactly how it's set up.
And, yeah, Samaya, that might have to be your dissertation, writing about that space. And like the way you describe it, it's a place, it's kind of a democratizing space too. Like when you go into Cups, everybody's a
Mhm,
consumer, you
mhm,
know, or working there or a customer.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
But I mean, and I think the thing that becomes interesting, and the thing that is so telling about it all, is that that is the place that the community comes together.
yeah,
It's the place, you know, I suspect, because I've had places like that in places that I've lived. You put a note on the wall if you want something. You put, you know, there, it's not to say that there's a bulletin board. It may not be that absolutely there, but you ask if you can put a poster up when somebody's doing something. So it really does become a center in ways that go so beyond food,
Mhm,
but that are the result of people's quest for food,
mhm.
so that you've got all of that that happens with it as well.
and thus why those particular individuals happen to meet at and be there to witness, you know, before they entered or
Well,
after they were
it
leaving.
was it was the epicenter of a community, and therefore the community. I have not yet looked at the tape because I am just physically unable to watch that.
Mhm,
But but so because it was the epicenter of the community, it is where the community bears witness,
mhm,
because the, you know, it's that spot.
mhm.
It's,
Right.
well,
And thinking
we're
of
we're
Trayvon Martin and his Skittles and a tea.
yeah, absolutely. Again, and we this there's been those incidents in Southern and American history as far back as we go.
No,
Let's open this up, maybe Daniel, to if there's, do we have a few minutes for a few questions? We've used up a lot of our
We
time.
we absolutely do. I mean, I've just enjoyed listening to this conversation about how, you know, food is this thing that binds us together, but it's also this container for memory. And one of the questions I'd love to put to all three of you is actually from one of our attendees tonight. She writes, "I'm inspired by the personal connections and reflections." And she asks, how do we challenge institutions like museums, academia, et cetera, to acknowledge the personal histories and material objects that embody them as worthy of study and analysis? And she asks if we've seen a shift toward this practice in more recent times.
well, I would say, Samaya, you're the one that's studying museums, so I'm going to yield to you.
Is there, she asks, is there a shift in more recent times?
Yeah,
I think that there is, even starting with the International Council of Museums' new definition of what museums serve to do. I think they're becoming more cultural centers and resources for communities instead of just elite houses for objects. Like, so now we can really tell stories of these objects, or find those hidden stories that's not being told, or letting the community tell their own old untold stories. And just having a safe space and the freedom to dive into what you're interested in. You know, when I started this project, Dane didn't tell me, oh, you have to do this, you have to do that. He was just like, hey, you have to produce this and go for it. So just having that safe space to do that, it makes a big difference, because when you come from a marginalized community or a community where your voice is usually like quieted, or if you're a woman and a Black woman on top of that, your voice isn't really valued in these spaces. And it's just kind of reassuring to just, you have to just say it. Like, we want to hear what you think. We want to hear about those stories, your oral histories. We want to hear about you sitting at the table with your grandmother or your great grandparents and listening to their history and being able to just say it out loud, and being, again, just valued. So I think it's a shift coming in. I think um it's like a revolution within museums, not to be all radical, but
And it is. And Samaya too, I think, your generation too of women scholars, especially too, are learning you don't have to ask permission anymore
mhm,
from,
yeah,
you do what you want to do.
Yeah.
For so long, and the academy, it was, you had to get, I mean, of course, we have to go through all the rituals of the academy, and Daniel knows those really well.
We all know them really well.
Right, but I do think that there are so many younger women scholars today that have really inspired me, because they're not asking permission anymore in the same way. They're empowered to go on the journey they know they need to take,
absolutely.
and doing it.
Yeah. And have the support from our present elders, or the chief curator, or renowned scholars, Dr. Jessica Harris, or Dr. Marcy Ferris. So you have that support behind you, where it was like, I can do this, I can do this. This is all right. I can tell my story and stand firm on telling it.
Stand firm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Great.
Stevie Wonder, you better tell your story well, because if you lie, it will come to pass.
Well, and in fact, this is actually makes a really great segue, because I'm actually really excited tonight to announce that Samaya's work with us is not ending. In fact, we're very excited that her work on foodways with Old Salem and MESDA and our collections are not coming to a close. In partnership with the Chipstone Foundation, she'll be working with our Learning in Place and curatorial teams, as well as our Cherokee Advisory Committee, on a year-long project to research and document and explore and build programming around the diverse food cultures of the early American South. And so in a way, this conversation caps her work that began about 6 months ago, but it also really is the springboard for the next phase of her work that will start very, very soon.
Lovely. Absolutely lovely.
Great.
Well, Samaya, at Old Salem, please look into Abraham. I did work for Old Salem eons ago, and there was a gentleman who wrote one of those Moravian life histories, who I believe was named Abraham, and I think he might have been, that was my opinion back then, I'd have to go back and relook at things with new wisdom, from Mali, but he worked in the tavern. So he is connected to the foodways.
I'm already getting leads.
Right.
We have one more question from another of our attendees, and she wanted us to talk a little more about how we read memories into objects that are older and lack documentation or oral histories attached to them. I mean, we quoted Bernie Herman, there are no innocent objects, but sometimes those objects don't carry their evidence with them. How do you all approach things that survive physically, but maybe don't have as much context with them?
I don't know. I would think that, at some point we have to be careful, because there be dragons. What do you know? What do you read into it? It may have to do with where. How do you see a finger mark? Do you see it worn in such a way that it might have been held in a hand in such a way as opposed to such a way? But I think that there is danger in attributing memory to something that doesn't necessarily come with it. because I think then we put our ideas on things as opposed to, as opposed to what might otherwise be the case. I think we've seen that in a lot of ways as we now look at things, and we look at the fact that memory is multifaceted. One of the most astonishing pieces for me in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC is that there is an auction block, a slave auction block that is there, and it was saved and preserved not because it was a slave auction block, but because two fairly minor politicians had a debate on top of it. And that's the only reason it survived. So that, we have to be careful with this memory, because the memory is very much inflected by point of view, and that may change, and usually does. So I think that things that don't come with memory are very, let's not put our memory on them, because as we know, and as we are now learning more and more, one of the things that we're learning in this particular revolution that we are currently going through is that something that we think is X may very well be Y. And, as we look at it as Y, Lord knows we may discover it really is Z. So that whole notion of this is it and it's fixed and firm, I think that's the thing that's becoming fluid. And I think that's the thing that's so fascinating.
Well, and the chicken brick is a good example. It's like we have some information about it. I mean, the provenance of it, and you know the maker, but we don't know much really other than that. But and that's a good place to begin. It as a container, it's so symbolic in that and that's what we should assume. There's a lot of voices in there.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of voices speaking, and they're just like on the cookie jar, they're kind of pushing out and saying to us, pay attention and don't assume anything. And just even that smell of chicken, that says this was used, we assume it was in use, but that's powerful to me. But again, that we begin with what we don't know. Mm-hmm. And you open it up and think, who are all the people that could possibly interact with this piece?
Right.
Rather than assuming, as we always did, and kind of and in earlier generations of an older time, of what did provenance look like, and who
right.
I mean, Daniel could speak to this better. It was a very elite world of who did that include, and whose story was told. That has changed drastically at MESDA.
Well, as Samaya said earlier, it may have belonged to a white family, but the cook who used it might very well have been someone who was enslaved, or someone who was even free, but
labor
of African descent. So you've got two different things right there in the brick.
Yes.
And sometimes you just have to use objects, like y'all said, as conversation starters. Just see, what can you talk about? How can you relate today? Maybe you can't get the exact story from it or assume, but you can have a conversation about it, and it'd be amazing the things you can find out with just having a conversation with folks.
Exactly. And I think that's actually a wonderful note to conclude this evening on, because that is the idea behind these conversations. What happens when you take two seemingly different objects from different places and put them into dialogue with each other, and put incredibly smart people with those objects in dialogue as well. A mentor of mine once said, objects are really good at asking questions. They're not always good at answering them, but they're really good at asking them. And I think this really is just the beginning of a much longer conversation. Samaya, with your work with us, Jessica, you will be here with us next spring for the MESDA Design Seminar. Marcy, I'm going to get you here as soon as we can all travel again post-COVID, but it really is a constant evolution. You know, we never really know everything. We need to always be open to new evidence, new interpretations, new ways of looking and seeing. And of course, I also want to thank our audience tonight for joining us, for asking great questions, and for your support, because of course, your gifts are what enables us to continue drawing these connections between things and bringing those conversations to you. And I, of course, need to say that if you've enjoyed tonight's conversation about things, be sure to check out our podcast, Things, A Global Conversation. You can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. And of course, you can join us in person, well, virtually in person. For future conversations, you can learn more at mesda.org/things. Thank you all again so much for being with us tonight. I really appreciate your time, expertise, and most of all, your wisdom and your generosity in sharing with us.
Thank
you.